Let's discuss physical development, and in particular, we're going to talk about physical development or body growth and the relationship to personality. That's where we're going with this screencast. So, the greatest percentage of body growth is during the early years, basically birth to about age 5. If you take most children on their third birthday, they will be, if you check their height, they will be about half of their adult height at that time. So you can kind of track kids that way. Now, obviously, not every kid develops the same rate and so on. A lot of times you'll hear kids that are at the 99th percentile, and what that means is they've grown faster than 99% of the people, at their age group. So, but is that a good thing? Is that a bad thing? That's one of the things that we're going to take a look at. Let's talk about some generalizations of early maturing individuals and then late maturing individuals. So let's just take boys first. Early maturing males. Now, we're talking about basically boys who hit puberty before their peers, so before other kids their age. And those kids tend to be much more self confident. They tend to be more socially responsible. They tend to be more popular. If you think about it, those are the kids who tend to be very good at athletics. They're the first kids picked on the playground. They're the ones that lead the athletic teams, and all the other kids tend to look up to them. Other boys want to be like them. And so, again, they tend to be very popular, very confident. It's kind of a good thing for a boy to be an early maturing male. There's a lot of positives that go along with that. Now, late developing males may not have the physical strength to be able to participate in some of those activities. So they're physically not capable of doing the things that the other boys are doing. So this can affect their social development, their personality, along with their self-confidence and the popularity and all that. They tend to be the ones that are more shy. They're sometimes more introverted, sometimes feeling a little bit more inferior to kids their age. A lot of times, those are the boys that will try to find something else that they can do well to kind of make up for that lack of physical ability. So they may pick, for example, video games. They're the best around at video games because that's something they can excel at, and it doesn't take somebody who's physically strong to do it. Or they may turn to something, in school, some kind of a subject in school. Or maybe they turn to music or something of that nature where you don't have to be physically superior to be able to do that. So basically what we're saying is for males, early development tends to be better for them, makes things a little easier for them, growing through those awkward stages. And then for boys, for late maturing boys, tends to be kind of an issue where sometimes they try and figure out something else where they can compensate by not having to be physical. Let's talk about females. Now, in females, the differences that we see between early maturing and late maturing females are not as great as we see between boys. But there's another thing that kind of issue that comes up with females. So early maturing females, let's talk about that first, okay? Not trying to embarrass anybody, but with females, when females hit puberty, it tends to be very noticeable, okay? People notice, okay? Their bodies change in a variety of ways that that are hard to hide for the females. So sometimes they become actually more shy and introverted, the early maturing females, because they don't know what's going on. They are not secure in their physical structure, and there's nobody or very few people around them who they feel like they can talk to about it, because nobody else has been going through these stages. So that's a very difficult time for early maturing females. However, late maturing females, these are girls who basically they're sitting around saying, wait a minute, everybody else has made the changes. What's wrong with me? And so they may view themselves as being less adequate. They may have somewhat poorer relationships with their parents and with other peers. It's a kind of a double negative for females. If you're early developing, that's kind of a negative. If you're late maturing, that's a negative also for females. So that's kind of, I feel bad for girls that aren't right there in the midst of, the middle when they go through this time period, because it's a difficult thing at either end. Now, how important is this? How big of an issue is this going to be in terms of their attitude and whether or not they feel inferiority, toward others? A lot of it has to do with the attitude that their parents and their friends have upon, a person's physical development. If they're constantly being picked on about it, that's a bad thing, obviously. But if parents and friends don't make an issue of it, they don't see it as a big deal, then the child themselves may not feel that it's that big of a deal. The most important factor, obviously, is how they themselves feel about their development. And in either case, the thing to remember is that in boys or girls, this can lead to inferiority issues where they just don't feel competent compared to everyone else. Now, another thing that affects people a lot as they're growing up is the gender roles. Now, first of all, let me tell you, the word gender, it's kind of a pet peeve with me, because people misuse this term a lot nowadays. Gender and the word sex is not the same thing. They're definitely not the same thing. When somebody says, what sex are you, what they're referring to is male and female. But when somebody asks or discusses gender, what you're really talking about is whether you are masculine or feminine. I don't know why, but in the last 10 to 15 years, we've had an incredible increase in the number of, forms that you will get, like a survey that you have to fill out, and one of the first questions says, what's your gender? And it's got M or F. Well, obviously they're indicating, are you a male or a female? Well, gender is neither one of those. Gender is masculine or feminine, and they don't need to know on all those forms. What they're really wanting to know is, are you a boy or a girl? Are you a male or female? But they're asking it the wrong way. So please make sure you use this term properly. Now that you know what gender means, when we talk about those gender roles, we're talking about masculine roles within society and feminine roles. And the influence of this begins immediately. Absolutely from birth. When little boys come out and all of a sudden they stick a little blue hat on them, and little girls come out and they put a little pink hat on them, and now you can look in and you can say, oh, look at the boy or look at the girl. And what they've found is that people treat them obviously differently from the very first minutes that they're with them. Years ago, they did a Baby X experiment, and they basically took the same group of babies. Some of them were boys, some of them were girls, but they took the same babies and dressed them up differently. Sometimes they dressed them as a boy, sometimes they dressed them as a girl, and then they watched to see how adults would interact with the children. And they found that if a baby was dressed up as a boy, adults would be more rough and tough with them in their play. They'd bounce them up and down on the knee. They would get them on the floor and roll around with them, and they'd, get the boy toys basically and play with them, cars and things like that. Whereas if the person was dressed up as a girl, even if it was a boy, but if they were dressed up as a girl, well, then they would not play with them as much. They wouldn't be as physical and as active with them, but they'd talk to them more. They'd sit there and just, ooh and ah and talk and make faces and all that. And you think about it, okay, if girls are talked to more frequently, they're going to grow up and they're going to become more verbal oriented. Boys aren't as verbal and tend to be more active. And so those gender roles take a big significance from very early on. Now, years and years ago, if someone, violated their gender, okay, if a boy acted feminine, if a girl acted masculine, they were basically ostracized in society. Nowadays, it's become much more open and people are much more accepting of people who are different. So it's not nearly as bad today. Not that those things have ended, but at least it's better today than it was years ago. And then the last thing we'll mention here, and that is when kids get to a certain age, they start experiencing love and they start developing relationships. And this brings up the issue of what's important, what are factors that go into whether or not you love someone or whether or not you want to have a relationship with them. And I want you to think for just a second, would you be willing to marry someone who you did not love? Now think about that. If somebody came up and said, hey, we want you to get married to so-and-so, and you did not love that person, would you consider it? Would you think about it? Would you be willing to do so? Under what conditions would you be willing to do so? Now, the reason I bring this up is because this is kind of a societal issue. In our culture, okay, in America, we tend to view marriage and love as going together. And most people would indicate that there's very few times when they would consider marrying someone that they didn't love. Love is the number one factor in terms of choosing a spouse within the United States. But I want you to understand it's not that way worldwide. Now, this ranking is actually from several years ago, but it kind of gives you an idea of some of the things that other cultures around the world will look at as extremely important factors when discussing whether or not they would be happy in choosing a spouse. You look at some of these, okay, how smart somebody is, or their education, their ambition, how refined or neat they are, their desire for kids, good health, those kind of things. I mean, emotional stability, those are all things that around the world are sometimes viewed higher than love in terms of choosing a spouse. Now, you also have to remember that in our culture, we tend to choose our own spouse. But in a lot of other cultures around the world, sometimes marriages are arranged by family members. And so, in those situations, it may not be a situation where love is a factor. It may be more of an economic factor, or there may be other things that come into play. So, just so you understand, when we talk about love, that's our version of choosing a spouse.